Welcome, everyone. I can see that you are now pouring into our webinar room. It's so good to have you. We thank you for joining us today for what I believe is a very important topic of discussion, applying a trauma-informed framework to the IEP process. We're excited to hear from Dr. Rossen today. I've had a good opportunity to get to know Dr. Rossen, who's right here with me, and I'll introduce here in just a minute or so. But let's talk about our outline. So if we can go to the next slide, I want to make sure that you know what to expect. We do have a little introduction, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Rossen for the actual webinar. We will have time for a Q&A. So if you will please put your questions, your curiosities into the chat, we will be monitoring those very closely. And we will take time at the end of the presentation to talk through as many of those as we possibly can, considering the time limits that we do have. So if you don't know where the chat is, you will go to the bottom of the Zoom window, and there is an icon that will be labeled chat, and it will look like a speech bubble. When you click on that icon, on the right side of your screen, a window will appear that's labeled chat. And there's a small area at the bottom where you can type in a question. When you're done typing in a question, you press enter or return on your keyboard, and that will submit the question in, and we'll monitor those closely. So thank you for that. I want to tell you a little bit about Illuma and why we're here today. I'm the founder and CEO of Illuma, and I'm a big believer in providing resources and access to high quality clinicians, educators, and resources. And Illuma is founded on that principle. We've been around for about 10 years. We have hundreds of people dedicated to doing this, and we've served over 22,000 students in special education. And I'm excited for this topic because I believe that there is a need for us to look at the social emotional learning as well as the mental health status of our students and figure out ways that we can help support them as they strive to become the best they can be. And so let me, if I can ask you to go to the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about why we're doing these webinar series, because for us, inviting Dr. Rossen is a great opportunity not only partner and learn from Dr. Rossen and implement better practices, but also to help you as a listener understand what you can apply in the IEP process. So we'll be recording this webinar and distributing it within 72 hours. We'll also have follow-up webinars. We'll share the details of that next webinar at the end of our presentation today. So make sure you stick around. And then last but not least, I want to introduce Dr. Rossen. Really, the reason we're here is for you. We've had nearly 700 folks register to learn from this information and learn from Dr. Rossen's experience. Like I said, I've gotten to know you, Dr. Rossen, a little bit better. Great personality, great human being, a lot of experience. And I can tell you, he's a real human that has a lot of real experience. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn from him. But today, he's the Director of Professional Development and Standards for NASP, the National Association of School Psychologists. And he's also the editor of Supporting and Educating Traumatized Students, a guide for school-based professionals, hence the topic and discussion today, right? He's co-authored Apply a Trauma-Informed Framework to the IEP Process, from Referral to Development. He's worked in public schools as an independent practitioner, has served as a college instructor and adjunct faculty, but he's also presented across the US and internationally, published dozens of articles and book chapters related to this topic, and school psychology, school safety, trauma. So I think it's safe to say that Dr. Rossen is qualified to speak on this topic and has got a lot to share. So without any further ado, Dr. Rossen, thank you for being here. We'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, and to the whole team at eLuma for the range of webinars you're offering and for inviting me. I will say there was one important bullet left off of here as far as my bio goes. I am an amateur chess player. My record is 0-3, but it is something I'm working on, an important part of my identity.
That's awesome. You know what's funny about that? Just my son and I just had a little chess game during a lunch hour. He loves it. So we'll have to talk about that later.
Yeah, we should. Does he give lessons? Anyway, thank you again for having me here. As Jeremy mentioned, I do work at NASP, though I'm not necessarily representing NASP today. This is actually work I started while I was a school psychologist in a large public school system in Maryland, Prince George's County Public Schools, and really trying to understand and learn about trauma and really trying to get a better understanding about what I was seeing as kind of what seemed like a broad underlying framework or concern that was affecting many of my students that I couldn't quite pinpoint. One thing I always like to start off my presentations with is one of my favorite quotes. If you've seen one school, you've seen one school. Some of you may have heard this as one size fits one. It's a reminder that there is no formula or cookie cutter approach. So I want to recognize every child, every school, every community is different. And so to some degree, I present information in generalities at times, and it's you as professionals that have the opportunity to apply that information in your unique context. A little disclaimer, as Jeremy mentioned, there's a book that I wrote with Dr. David Bateman, who's a special ed professor in Shippensburg University with LRP Publications. So a lot of the work is from there. So just want to make that disclaimer known. I know I have about 30 to 40 minutes to present. I have about like 50 minutes of content. So at times it may seem like I'm speeding through something. It's information I wanted to at least include in the slide deck, but not going to talk at length about. So there's a link at the bottom of this slide, and this really good article that kind of highlights kind of where things are in the world of trauma and its interaction with special education services and IEPs. I pull some information here that I want to highlight some recent case law, but there is not a lot of precedent when it comes to how does trauma kind of play into the IEP process. But there is some. I think one thing that this quote does is it kind of highlights the mandate to really start thinking about the impact of trauma in special education. But again, given the current language within IDA, there's a lot of confusion and inconsistent application about how that plays in. So here's one actual case. This was a Health Justice Alliance lawyer in DC, and they wanted to make a student's IEP trauma informed. And so you can see that the lawyer said trauma should be described in the IEP and his accommodations should be trauma informed. The school's attorney said, well, we have to be careful not to go outside of what's needed for FAPE, right? We can discuss ADHD and his annual goals, but we can't talk about trauma. Now, in the end, the IEP team decided to describe the impact of trauma in the student's IEP, and they provided him with some trauma responsive accommodations and services. But I think what this does is this highlights this kind of push and pull between, what does the law say and what are the parameters within which we can work, and what is best serving to the student as far as how we design our IEPs, how we write our IEPs. Here's another case that I found particularly interesting. The school social worker found that the child experienced an extremely traumatic history beginning when he was 12 years old. He was experiencing chronic sexual abuse. He had been suspended a few times in the last few months. He was fighting with other students, was found to have drugs at school, talked about killing himself. So he had some suicidal ideation, a lot of self-reported attention problems. And so, applying the definition of emotional disturbance, which includes inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under normal circumstances, the school district determined that the child's behavior and feelings were not, quote, inappropriate under normal circumstances, because the traumatic events in the child's life made his circumstances, quote, anything but normal. So you can see the quote here that they said, because they've been through a terrible ordeal, could be expected to act out, and therefore it was not appropriate to identify the student as requiring special education services. But the court, the Southern District Court of New York, they disagreed with that approach. And they said we have to consider what would be appropriate behavior for a child who has never experienced any of the horrors experienced by the child. So one is saying, well, in their context, in light of that child's circumstances, it's not unexpected what we're seeing. That's what the school said. And the court said, no, we should compare that student to maybe any other student who didn't experience some of that adversity and stress. So again, there's inconsistent application and understanding about how some of these things would be applied. Here's one more case where the LEA, the school district, denied eligibility to a 6-year-old that attempted suicide by jumping out of a school window, a 6-year-old. The agency justified the decision by saying that the emotional issues can mostly be attributed to familial transitions and traumatic events. So the US District Court ultimately held that the child qualified for special education under the category of emotional disturbance. So where does that leave us? A lot of people are probably wondering, okay, so what do I do? Should students who have experienced trauma receive special education services? Now, usually if I'm presenting this in a group, I usually say, do some breakout, have some discussion. Anyone want to share? It usually leads to very rich discussion. And usually the outcome is, well, it depends. I don't know, maybe, hard to say. And I think the answer really is, it depends. There is no hard and fast answer to this. I think one of the challenges, of course, is that when you look at a list of symptoms of trauma, and I will say this, there's this document from SAMHSA, which is, a federal agency on trauma, and they have a chart of symptoms of trauma that is like a 1.5 pages long. I mean, these are essentially symptoms that would overlap with dozens and dozens of different diagnostic criteria, different disabilities. And again, here, I just pulled a few. This is not all inclusive, but this highlights the issue with trauma sometimes. It manifests as behaviors that align with a range of other disabilities. So how do you tell one from the other? So this is another question I've gotten when I've done some presentations in the past, right? How do I tell trauma versus something else? How do I disentangle and untie that knot? Well, how do I know if it's trauma versus ADHD? How do I know if it's trauma or depression and which came first, right? My answer has been, I don't think we should be worrying about whether it's one or the other or what came first, right? A student can have both. It's possible for a student to have ADHD and a trauma history. It's possible that they have a trauma history and that's leading to symptoms of ADHD and they are exacerbating one another and there's some interaction effect. So my answer to this question, which has invariably come up, is that we should not spend our time worrying about untying that knot, and instead identifying the range of needs that the student has, right? The disability, a lot of times just based on a constellation of behaviors that as a whole are responsive to a set of interventions, right? That's the benefit of a diagnosis or identification of a disability. And so when we can have more information that maybe there's been some adversity and stress in the student's life, we incorporate that information into identifying the interventions we have. But to be so focused on saying, well, it's trauma, so they don't have ADHD is a false dichotomy in how we should be thinking about our students. So just a little pop quiz. You feel free to put your answer in the chat box. One study in Los Angeles found that children experiencing 4 or more ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences, these are kind of risk or stressors that occur in childhood that may lead to risk of trauma, were how many times more likely to be diagnosed with learning and behavior problems? Feel free to put your answer in the chat box if you'd like to guess. I see one person put 6 times, cold. Nick, getting warmer, 16. Ashley, 12. Colder, colder, colder. No, not 95. Okay, they're flying in. The answer is 32.6 times more likely to be diagnosed with learning and behavior problems. Now, that's correlation, not causation. So we don't want to say that ACEs cause learning or behavior problems, but we do know that there is at least a strong association between the two. Now, just a few more cases. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. You can read about this on your own if you'd like. This was actually filed in 2015, class action lawsuit filed on behalf of teachers and students that the school was not doing enough to support students with a trauma history. They invoked 504. They did not invoke IDEA, but they claimed that the students with the trauma history should be considered as students with a disability under ADA, invoking 504, like I said. Now, they asked for things like PD for staff, development of safe and supportive school environments, and employing appropriately trained school-employed mental health professionals. So they weren't necessarily saying all these kids need therapy, we need to be assessing all of them. It was, what are the broad tier 1 practices? And that's actually what the lawsuit was focused on. And then here's another one that kind of said the same thing. So again, some of the broader lawsuits that are, they tend to be more focused on the tier 1 issues. But again, when you talk about a trauma-informed approach, it is a multi-tiered process. And while it is tier 1 focused, I could talk about trauma-informed for a whole day, but trauma-informed broadly it falls within an MTS framework, but it's heavily loaded in the tier 1 area. But there are still applications to that information in the services we provide. And I think IEPs is one way to do that. So, to no surprise, you probably know, trauma is not represented in any existing disability category within IDEA, right? The only place it's mentioned is in Title I, Part C, related to infants and toddlers, and it's very specific to exposure to family violence, as you can see in the quote on this slide. So technically, no student can receive special education services specifically for trauma or a known history of adversity or stress that could lead to trauma. Remember too, that no mental health diagnosis is required in order to receive special education services. There must be some negative functional impact on students' educational performance that can be connected to an identified disability within IDEA, coupled with the need for services to obtain educational benefit. So if you were to identify a student with a long history of adverse childhood experiences, right? Maltreatment at home, exposure to community violence, all these things, but there was no direct observable impact, and they weren't meeting eligibility criteria for an existing disability, that would not make them eligible, even if you knew about that history. Now, 504, on the other hand, has no limiting list of recognized impairments. And I've seen school districts actually provide 504 plans for students with a diagnosis of PTSD, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder. So again, I know I'm speaking quickly, but I'll be happy to answer questions. You can always email me too afterwards. So if you proceed with the IEP or 504 process, how do you maintain a trauma-informed approach? So I'm going to try and walk through some pieces of the IEP process. And when I talk about the IEP process, I talk not just about writing the document, but everything from how we invite our parents, how we write our reports, how we design the IEP itself, the PLAPs, the goals, all those things, and the accommodations and the services we think about. All right, so present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, affectionately referred to as PLAPs. We know each IEP must contain a PLAP that includes how the child's disability affects their involvement and progress in the gen ed curriculum, right? So the issue many times is that our PLAPs simply describe an observable problem, right? So it might be, well, they're talking during instruction without raising their hand. Well, what will happen then is if that is how the PLAP is written and that's what it's focused on, the goal will probably be to just reduce or eliminate that behavior, right? Raise a hand before talking 4 to 5 times, or do not talk during instruction without raising a hand. It doesn't address whether it's a skill or performance deficit, though. Does the student lack the skill to sit still? Or is it that they can, but they won't, right? Can't do, won't do. And the reason this is really important, especially for students with a trauma history, is that a lot of the things that, or the outcomes of trauma, and especially ongoing stress and trauma, is they tend to be lower on a lot of those functional skill deficits, right? Working memory, sustained attention, establishing and maintaining relationships, executive functioning. And so a big part of a trauma-informed IEP is being able to shift our thinking to recognize the potential that the observable problems we're seeing is not a matter of motivation alone. And is not an issue of compliance or willful disobedience, but instead a high potential that there is a skill deficits in self-regulation, for example, things that actually can be built, things that actually can be strengthened in students. So imagine a scenario where your IEP has focused on reducing the students' trips to the teacher's desk, right? It's been very highly disruptive to the teacher, to the classroom instruction, to the flow and cadence of what you're trying to do. So you've shared the student, you've shared with the student what your goal is, right? Don't come to the desk as much. Fewer visits to during class. You set up a self-monitoring system. Visits to the desk have decreased. You crushed it. You nailed it. Bravo. Go home, have a beer. You nailed it. The question is, though, how has this benefited the student? So he now remains at his desk. He looks calm on the outside, but is he calm and prepared to learn on the inside? What skills have we taught him other than the lesson that his needs are a disruption to the flow of the classroom? So a trauma-informed IEP, as a start, focuses on building self-regulatory skills rather than only the behavior itself, right? So what skills does the child need? And I'm going to stop here for a second and say a question I often get then is, well, how do we create goals? I think I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but how do we create measurable goals if we're focusing on skills, right? So, and we're going to talk about what those skill statements might look like. But I want to be sure I hit this point. You can still use the same metrics to measure outcomes. So as I'll talk later, you can build in your goals and your statements to be skill oriented and skill building oriented. And then you measure outcomes using that same metric of visits to the desk. But if you're not including any skill component in there, it's going, what your IEP will be highly focused on is just compliance alone and not skill building. And I like to bring up this idea about skills the child needs, but also what resources does the child have? And I think of skills and resources as complementary but different things, right? So for example, the ability to establish and maintain relationships is a skill. Having friendships is a resource. And so things that you have, whether they're objects or conditions or personal resources, whether it's optimism or self-esteem, or you're healthy or you're financially stable, whether your family has 2 cars, right? These are resources. But and skills sometimes help you get resources and sometimes they're separate. So words matter too. Usually our IEP language is written around what the educator wants or needs rather than what the student needs. So I'm going to walk through some examples about how we can think about our present levels and our PLAPs and our goals to write them in a way that's focused on student needs and skill building rather than compliance issues alone. So for those that may have remembered the marshmallow study, this was an interesting study, one that some might say is borderline cruel. I did it to my own kids though, for what it's worth, just out of curiosity. One of them failed it. You put them in a space with a marshmallow in front of them and nothing else to distract them. some strange adult says, you can eat the marshmallow, but if you wait to eat it until I come back, you get a second one. And they looked at whether, they looked at how, not only how kids manage to resist eating the marshmallow, but whether there are outcomes associated with the kids that can resist it. And there were, but that's a tangent. Well, let's just say you're in that scenario and you have a kid in your class that is constantly eating the marshmallow, right? Well, the two bullets on the left here is probably how you might see a part of a plap or a statement written about what's happening. The student easily gives into temptation, or they're avoiding the teacher recommendation to wait to eat the marshmallow. And again, what that is implying is that they can do it, that they have the skills to do it and they're refusing, or they're just giving into temptation, which is kind of a dispositional statement. The ones on the right are just different ways you can write that. They lack the regulatory skill to avoid eating the marshmallow, or they struggle with applying regulatory strategies that they may have when given a marshmallow. What that will do, it's a very nuanced difference. What that will do is that will drive the next step where we're saying, well, then our goal is to develop and teach regulatory strategies, and then we can measure our success of that with whether he eats the marshmallow or not. So again, this is not a huge shift, but it's an important and nuanced one, right? So here's another example. Student regularly acts out in anger during instruction. Well, we can change that to say, well, they lack the ability to self-regulate independently when angry, and it results in frustration and disruption to learning. So it also, takes away this idea that, oh, this student, they're acting out in anger, right? That is something that they're kind of purposefully, some kind of calculated behavior that we're seeing. And the first one, our goal is probably just going to be like, stay still. So anyway, I see a comment in there. What about the idea of trust? That is a good point from Robin. There is a whole I could talk about this too. Trust expectation as having an impact on whether students eat that. And again, I don't have the time to go into that, but Robin, I agree with you completely. So these are a couple more examples. The ones on the top, the original these are actual statements that were found in IEPs from Help for Billy. And then these are just different ways you could write those. So again, the student's attention-seeking behavior results in frequently interrupting the teacher. So our goal is just going to be no more attention-seeking, right? Which to me, attention-seeking, I'll talk about this later, that's a bit of a trap. But instead, you can change those to focusing on or viewing behaviors as a function of self-regulatory problems, which are highly common in students with trauma histories, rather than seeing these as voluntary behaviors or willful disobedience. And here's another one. Student avoids the demands of activities he finds demanding through resistance or withdrawal, right? And this is just a student that comes across as highly difficult versus saying that they're overwhelmed, they lack self-regulatory skills, or they can't regulate their frustration, or they regulate their frustration in maladaptive ways. And so I don't think we have the time for you to try, but you can try that on your own. Hang out with your friends. It's Friday night, have some friends over for dinner and play a little game, modify this IEP. That'll be an interesting card game. Anyway, the other thing is I think a lot of times our IEPs are failing to consider the role of the adults. And so this is an actual statement from an IEP too. The student will respond in a calm manner when consequences are administered. Well, what you're doing is you're putting all of the onus on the student to be responsive. But think about two situations. One, something happens, the student's dysregulated. An imposing adult who's also dysregulated gets in the student's face and says, you're going home, I'm calling your mother, you're going to the principal's office, you're suspended, whatever. Versus the other student, or the other scenario where the student has an opportunity to regulate, to relate with an adult, and then has time to reason later on with a regulated adult. Now, the students has to respond in a calm manner regardless. No, that's just not fair. Many times adults can't regulate themselves, but we're asking kids to be calm all the time. So I just think when we put statements like this or goals like this, especially for students with trauma histories that have a high degree of hyperarousal, they have difficulty regulating themselves in moments like that, we're setting them up for failure. Goal setting. So don't do it or do it differently. So our goal is less about stopping something we don't want. That is an outcome. Our goal, though, is to teach and develop the skills and alternatives that enable the student to regulate whatever might be leading to that behavior. So again, grounded in the same idea that a history of stress and adversity can impact those outcomes. So it's less about stopping what we're seeing, which benefits the educator, and more about finding an alternative and skill building, which benefits both the student and the educator. This one, Maria will decrease protesting to 0 times per day, is again an actual statement I've seen. Personally, I have 2 daughters. If someone told them that they can never question something that they're told or seek clarification, I would have a problem with that. I want them to be able to not just assume that whatever they're told they have to do. Certainly, there are adaptive ways to do that, to communicate or to ask for clarification or elaboration, and to articulate that in a respectful way and be deferential. But again, what we want to do is we want to teach Maria that there is a way to do this, and not just say, be quiet and sit still. So if you've not heard of this, many of you have, or it comes in different forms, the dead man's rule for IEP goals. Can a dead man achieve the goal? Sit still, say nothing, do less, interrupt less. Don't visit me, don't talk to me. If those are your goals, they're not sufficiently ambitious. So some traps. Goals involving seeking attention, and you saw one before. Seeking attention is a developmentally appropriate behavior and need. I always say, if any of you have ever been on social media, adults like attention. No one's posting pictures of salads and seeing how many likes they get because they're being altruistic. They're attention grabs, and that's okay. Attention seeking is developmentally appropriate. We should be worried if kids are not seeking attention. Seeking attention should not be a focus of an IEP goal. We don't want goals that disempower or remove a sense of control, like you can't protest, you can't do this, you can't do that, because disempowering is, or even just saying like, we'll follow a teacher's directive all the time. That is highly disempowering. And we know students with trauma history often feel highly disempowered. And then goals that make assumptions. Again, assumptions about the student's skill, or maybe that what we were asking is just as rewarding as what we want them to stop doing. And then we also want to avoid goals that make no sense. These are actually, I always find these particularly interesting. You may have some of these in your own experience, like Grace will stay in the classroom 4 out of 5 times. I don't know what times means, or John will not take his clothes off at school in 7 out of 10 opportunities. I don't know how many opportunities there are to take clothes off in your school. I guess any moment is an opportunity if you think about it that way. They don't make sense to me. So let's think about goals a little bit. The one on the left is an example of an ineffective goal. The one on the right is an effective one. So as you're reading that, I want you to ask yourself, well, why is the one on the right more effective? The answer is the goal on the left focuses on the student not doing something and reducing attention-seeking behavior. Those are both the traps that I just talked about. So the new goal has a component of teacher instruction, focuses on active responses from the student, defines an appropriate expected behavior for classroom participation. This is a meaningful goal. The one on the left, the ineffective one, is a compliance goal. The one on the right, importantly, also sets a stage for an intervention strategy. It teaches the student something, even if it's as basic as how to effectively raise your hand, a skill we often just assume kids know and that they can do. All right, here's another one. Why is the one on the right more effective? Well, the purpose of the goal is to improve behavior. It focuses on teaching the skill of asking for clarification when directions are misunderstood or confusing, doing that appropriately, doing that well. This then drives the process of a focus on teaching how to do that, rather than just saying, don't do it. And the second when you have stopped interrupting or bothering me, that is when we have achieved our goal. Another thing to think about is, do your goals focus on outputs or outcomes? The outcomes are what you want or need to achieve. The outputs are the actions or items that contribute to achieving an outcome. And so I think a lot of times, we are talking only about outputs and less about outcomes. And I think it's important to consider both, but there's a difference between the two. And then goals can focus on maintaining and building strengths too. So this is an actual IEP goal that was put in someone's IEP, is slightly modified a little bit, but Heather will continue to use her strength of curiosity to ask for clarification on assignments at least once per day. And so doing that builds on the student's strength. This is valuable for all students, not just students with trauma histories. So, the value of strengths focus is probably not new to anyone, but this idea that asking what's wrong with you is where you may go, setting high expectations can be a very empowering experience for students. So then thinking broadly about the related services, goals, and accommodations that you can think about either, or if you're doing a 504 too, you can identify and reduce or prevent certain triggers. I've shared this. This is actually a more school-based intervention, but there was a school that had a high level of community violence. And we know that when there's exposure to something like that, there's a high degree of hypervigilance, right? That the idea that, if someone drops a textbook and it's really loud, it will engage a stress response for those students. Well, they found after talking to some students that the bells were really jarring between classes. This was a high school. So what they ended up, or maybe it was middle school. But what they ended up doing was they changed it to have music play when it was time to change classes. And then the music would stop 30 seconds before, before they had to be in their next class. And then they built it in as part of a positive behavior system where, certain students could select the songs from a pre-selected list that were, didn't have vulgarity or whatever in it. It actually was very successful and kind of change, they saw a potential trigger and modified that. So again, increasing predictability, self-regulation, looking at the use of things like breaks. I know I can say I've seen breaks used as an intervention strategy in many IEPs with the assumption that kids know what to do with that break. I've seen many kids sitting outside in the hallway, being sent outside when they're dysregulated with nothing to do and being told to calm themselves down, expecting that they know how to do that and that's actually not going to dysregulate them further. I've got about another 7 to 8 minutes of content. Is that okay? I know we were said we were going to end around 1:40.
Yeah, if you go up to 150 and we leave those 10 minutes at the end, we'll be just fine.
Perfect. So, and I mentioned that family school collaboration and thinking about families as a part of the IEP process is really important too. We know that when kids are stressed or when families are stressed, kids are stressed. We know from a lot of research that stress is actually contagious. There's research that found among adolescents, when their peers or their family members are experiencing high level of stress, they report traumatic stress symptoms. So what would you say on this one? And an analysis of local and state procedural safeguards provided to families. How many were written at a college reading level or higher? Okay, I see a lot of C's. The answer is D. And 39% were actually at the graduate or professional range. So right away, we're creating a great deal of separation. And I realize these are kind of legally driven, but it's important to understand the context of how some of our initial contacts with families are in an already a highly stressful environment and experience. If you ask anyone who's ever been in the school setting as a professional working with students in the context of special education and then becomes a parent, you will often hear how illuminating that experience is, not in a very positive way, but it changes how they interact with families. So some things you could think about are before your meetings, right? I know timing is always a tough one. In many schools I worked in, parents were waiting for an hour and a half. Some great things I've seen is schools sharing parking and transportation information, even just saying there's free parking and here's where you park. Because a lot of times we just assume that they'll figure it out. Telling them what topics will be discussed, some of the concerns that might arise, what their roles or rights are. During the meeting, thinking about just how you set up the room and the seating arrangements, right? I remember one point as a staff, we had this long conference table, and we found that people at one end were often highly disengaged, and so we worked hard to try and get it more circular or a big square, or it created less of this like boardroom type look. I've heard of schools that will send a roster of participants with even their pictures and their names and their role. So we're not going around the room with these very intimidating titles, especially for maybe families that where English is a second language. Everyone has, ist or gist at the end. I'm a therapist, I'm a psychologist, I'm a highly intimidating, and oftentimes can have a disengaging effect. Another thing, this last bullet here, evaluation. I've heard of some schools that actually have an anonymous evaluation where they ask families to provide input on their experience to see how they can make it better. Asking questions about, did you feel like did you feel like your questions were asked? Did you feel like your concerns were addressed? What can we do better in the future? I think we need to think about our reports. I'm a school psychologist, and so I'm certainly aware, and I'm guilty of writing highly pedantic, unhelpful reports in the past, especially when I was first starting. I came out of school around 2006, out of my doctoral program. So parents, as consumers of psych reports, often do not understand the information, creates barriers in decision making, less likely to engage in making important choices, has silencing effect, reduces the ability to advocate, and there's research to support all of those things, dating back from the 90s all the way up until now. So here's another pop quiz for you. The average reading level of psychological reports is what? Let's see if you can put your answers in the, I see B, C, okay, mostly C's, couple A, couple D. So the answer is C. And if you're looking at those clinical neuropsych reports, it was over 20. Now, let me give you some context. Stephen Hawking described Einstein's theory of relativity at a reading level of 11.3. So they can be better. All of our reports, not just psych reports. I found this really interesting study. This is the name of the study. And in the experiments, they found that efforts to sound smarter by using more complex words had the opposite effect. They were judged to have less intelligence. And it was taken as a sign of low credibility and poor intelligence. So when we're dealing with families in our reports and our general communication, we want to speak simply, we want to speak clearly, we want to speak plainly. as much as possible. So this is a great book from a great book called Writing Useful, Accessible, and Legally Defensible Psychoeducational Reports. And they talk about just an example about how we can write a little better. Something's cut off on the left here, but they changed the reading level from 17.8 to 9.2 by modifying those two sentences. But on the right here, this is what you might see, and we can just say things like John is healthy versus John has not experienced any significant illnesses, injuries, or hospitalizations. Just a style that we need to focus on. So I'm not going to spend a great deal of time going through these as far as thinking about consumer-oriented reports. These require some degree of an agreed upon structural change among the professionals that write the reports. But there are resources and tools to do that. There was actually one, someone just asked what the book name was. It was Writing Useful, Accessible, and Legally Defensible Psychoeducational Reports. This is an example of the entirety of the social emotional test results, where they have the appendix and scores is all at the end. And there were studies, and they found parents and teachers all felt that they could engage and discuss the child more, or engage more deeply when using a consumer report. They actually used a same made-up student and wrote a traditional report and then wrote a consumer-oriented report. Even in that same vein, one could argue that those pedantic reports can potentially violate FAPE by impeding the parent's opportunity to participate. So the last thing I want to mention here in the presentation before we get to the questions is sometimes I get this question, should we include information about trauma in our reports, right? And regardless of what role you're in, if you learn about a history of adversity or a history of trauma and you're writing up your report, there are concerns sometimes about whether to include that, maybe concerns around stigma or confidentiality. Personally, I believe the benefits of informing an appropriate plan and documenting those experiences far outweigh the costs. So when it comes to confidentiality, you can talk to the family, emphasize that only those with a legitimate need to know have access to that information. If you include it, it should pass the so what test. Does it help you or the reader understand the student better? Does it help you understand their unique challenges? Does it help us better inform our planning? There was a study in West Virginia in 2019, and they looked at 100 students receiving special ed services. Half of the parents reported one adverse childhood experience. Only 4% of the reports, though, included mention of ACEs, and only 17% of the IEPs mentioned a history of ACEs. So maybe in some cases it was perceived irrelevance, but in other cases I've spoken to practitioners and they just say they feel uncomfortable including it. So my suggestion is include it, but one way to empower the families that maybe feel uncomfortable is give them input, the ability to influence the language that's used and how that's being described. You want to reinforce the confidential nature of the documents. But again, that can empower them in a way too, by saying you have input in how this information is shared, but I feel it's really important for us to be sure that we're meeting the students' needs. So we can jump to some questions now. Thanks for humoring my need for extra time. I apologize for that.
No, this, as a matter of fact, you're right on time, and this has been fabulous. We've got quite a few questions, and
Okay.
we have 10 minutes left before we need to let people back to their day. So we may not get through all of these. We have written down all the questions that have come through the chat, and we'll answer them in that order.
Okay.
Now, one common question for everybody is you will have access to a copy of the slide deck presentation as well as a recording of this webinar within 72 hours, and that will be sent to your email that you use to register. So, Dr. Rossen, let's get to the first one here. It is from Sabine. And Sabine says, for these cases earlier in the presentation, where LEA denied services, did the child get a full psychoeducational assessment, or how were they referred?
Good questions. This one's easy. I don't know. I haven't actually dug deep into the case law. You can certainly look up those cases because I provided, I think, the legal citation for it. They're also referenced in that article. The first slide where I had a link, and I think, Jeremy, you put that link
Yes.
of that PDF article. They might provide a little more information in those, so you can look those up. I'm sorry, I don't know though.
It's all
Good
good.
question.
The second question we have is from Tasha. Where can we find that chart?
That chart.
In the
Which
first
chart?
link by chance. And actually, I should answer this one. I can answer this one. It was a chart that was earlier in the slide deck, and you will have access to that when we share the slide deck. So that was
Was
an
it the
easy
chart
answer.
where was it like the symptoms of trauma and relationship to disabilities? Maybe I think that's the only chart.
Yeah, it was trauma symptoms and what it looks like.
Yeah, I kind of made that. So that's not necessarily, so you can find it in the slide deck that you'll be getting.
Perfect. Third question is from Carrie. How descriptive do you write the language in the IEP connecting the trauma to the disability?
Interesting. I mean, when you're talking about descriptive, I imagine you mean, kind of the depth of information about what you know. And I sort of addressed that a little bit at the end, as far as, not only including in the report, but in the IEP and just basically your formal documents. It should always pass the so what test, in my opinion. So why are you including it? And are you including only the information that's needed to help better inform the educators that will be providing services, and to help better inform the process of designing a plan to support the student and the family? So, that so what test means, it's a very vague way of saying it of course depends.
Yeah.
There's a lot of professional judgment that needs to be applied, which for some is not a helpful answer, right? Because it would be great to say, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, 5 or 6 is the sweet spot, and you don't go into every detail. But in some cases, details are important.
Thank you for that commentary. The next one we have is from Emily. I'm a school psychologist working exclusively in early childhood, and we are seeing an increasing number of referrals related to ACEs and experiences of trauma. Do you have any resources or recommendations that would help us develop a trauma-informed framework for preschoolers specifically, and added challenges that we've been told Section 504 begins at kindergarten, not preschool?
Well, I think for starters, I mean, you can certainly, this resource that Dr. Bateman and I developed kind of goes into a lot more detail on all of these pieces when it comes to thinking about a framework. I think it would be the same for preschoolers when it comes to thinking about skill building versus compliance, behavior compliance focused. I think an important piece to remember and to share with your team is that ACEs is not the same thing as trauma, right? The ACEs questionnaire is it's a risk indicator. If you have 4 ACEs, you're not traumatized per se. In fact, there's plenty of research to find that among people that experience ACEs, a minority of them develop traumatic stress symptoms. And so we don't want to equate the two. If you know about ACEs, you know that there's risk. But I wouldn't necessarily assume that there is full-blown clinical trauma. So you want to avoid assumptions. You want to acknowledge that the history of ACEs puts them at risk for some skill deficits in areas of things like self-regulation, relationship building, and focus on those skills rather than just, we want the student to, be quiet, stop, if they're yelling, we want you to yell 0 out of 5 times, right?
Right.
Well, how do we get there? And so a lot of times we need to think about less like, oh, we need sticker charts, and more skill building, family engagement, things like that.
Awesome. I think we have time for one or two more,
Mhm.
and then we'll have a few that maybe we can follow up with. But this one comes from Joanna. How do you measure, quote unquote, effectively communicate?
Okay, so I'm guessing that is in when I was talking earlier about how we might modify some language. Now, again, this question comes up regularly. If you are focused on skill building, how do you measure that skill acquisition? And again, my suggestion is that you can keep your initial metric that you would have previously done, right? So if it was protesting, I think that was what it was about, that Maria is protesting too much, right? She's talking out and saying to the teacher, no, I won't, or that's dumb, whatever. That you're measuring that by the same metric that her protesting goes down, right? And that could be through some kind of teacher observation. So you're not measuring some communication score. You're measuring it by the same outcome, but you're building into the process a clear mechanism that is how that will be achieved. But we don't want to just say, we're going to give you access to this reward if you shut up for this week, right? Because that is a compliance goal, and we're just like bribing her to not discuss her concerns versus actually teaching her a skill that she can use.
I love it.